Hello, my name is Timm Kroeger. I'm an environmental economist with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to talk about key principles in analyzing the return on investment of watershed conservation programs. And I'm going to do so with the help of a case study that we completed recently that makes it easier to put into practice and understand what it looks like in real life when you actually apply these ROI principles. Just for context, there's a recent study that looked at the impact of watershed degradation on water treatment costs and water capital cost. And so that study found that for approximately 1/3 of the world's cities, watershed degradation over the last century has increased water treatment costs by about 50% and capital costs by about 40%. So that's just to highlight the importance that watershed degradation has on water treatment costs. And so this is one of the reasons why we're interested in exploring the role that natural infrastructure might play in improving water quality and therefore reducing treatment costs and capital costs. And so why ROI study, return investment studies? So we know from global analysis using largely global data sets that there must be quite a few places globally where watershed restoration, meaning implementation of best management practices, forest conservation, forest restoration, would have a positive return on investment for drinking water, and in some cases also for hydroelectricity and other water uses. But the question is, when it really comes down to understanding whether watershed restoration is an economically favorable activity to improve water quality in a given location, then we still need to drill down further, go beyond those global data sets, and try to understand what the return on investment is for a particular watershed conservation program. After we do that, we can compare the economic performance of watershed restoration with alternative solutions, such as upgraded treatment or development of new water sources, right? So that's really the backdrop for ROI analysis. We think that globally there is a wide scope for implementing watershed restoration, but really when it comes down to analyzing and understanding how it performs in a given case, we do need a local analysis. And so that's what I'm going to try to explain and walk through how we did this in a recent study and how we usually go about doing that. And so the reason why we do return on investment analysis is to first understand whether there is an economic rationale for watershed conservation in a given watershed, right? So whether it makes economic sense, whether there's a business case or whether there's an economic case for watershed restoration. But beyond that, at the design stage of a conservation program, you can use this analysis also then to select your intervention portfolio, meaning what intervention you put on the watershed, where you do that, right? And so basically physically where you do what on the watershed to improve water quality. And if you have that information, you can actually use it to maximize the return on investment of your particular watershed conservation program. So these two reasons, are primarily why we do watershed return on investment analysis. And so what you see here is what I call the analytical framework that we think you would want to apply based on literature recommendations when you do return on investment analysis. And so this is basically all about linking your intervention on the ground, how you modify the watershed physically, to the benefit you want to analyze. In some cases, that might be water treatment plant intake water quality, right? That's the example I'm going to be using here. So how does actually our intervention filter through and modify the watershed and eventually reach the users whose return on investment we want to evaluate? And so that involves a series of analytical steps, lots of modeling involved usually. And the reason why you would want to generally apply each of those steps is to ensure the credibility of your results, not just outward facing, but also to help you understand what the actual return on investment, the economic case basically is for your intervention program. And so I'm going to be using a case study that I already alluded to. It was done in a fairly small watershed in Brazil, the Camboriú watershed, which is in Santa Carolina province in the southeast of Brazil. And so there we did a return on investment analysis on a fairly recent watershed conservation program, the water producer program in Camboriú. And so that's what I'm going to be using as an example to walk you through how to do credible return on investment analysis. So this picture shows you just briefly where the intake point is that we're concerned about. So that's the red dot on the map. That's the water treatment plant raw water intake. And so the main purpose of this program is to improve water quality, specifically with respect to sediment levels, and specifically total suspended solids at the intake point. So that's the primary goal, to reduce total suspended solids concentration, because that leads to reduced water losses in the treatment process and also reduced treatment costs. I'm going to go later into some more detail, but it's a fairly small watershed, like I said, about 200 square kilometers. But certainly all the principles I'm going to talk about also apply to any other size watershed, right? And so let's start with the beginning. First off, like I mentioned, we really need to understand how our interventions modify the physical reality on the ground, ecosystem structure, watershed ecosystem structure, if you will, because that will eventually drive what benefits we get out of it at the end. So to do that, we really need to understand how the watershed is behaving, right? Without the watershed conservation program, what would happen on the landscape? So that's basically our baseline, our business as usual scenario, right? The reality that we'd be facing if we didn't have a program to conserve and or restore the watershed. And so that usually is done with the help of modeling, right? Because we don't know actually what the future looks like. We need to basically create scenarios of what we think is the most likely future state of the watershed that we seek to modify through our interventions. And so in the Camboriú case, what we did is we first looked at a fairly recent period of land cover change, about 10 years of land cover change, and between 2003 and 2012 to understand what's going on in the watershed. And so that's what you see on these pictures here. That usually involves, as it did in this case, lots of ground truthing. So you actually need to go in the field and sample specific locations that represent specific watershed features that you then use in your modeling to make sure that, in fact, what you think in the satellite image is an eucalyptus plantation is, in fact, a eucalyptus plantation, for example, and not a mature forest. So that's where the ground truthing comes in. Once you do that, you can essentially construct, using these 10 years of data that you have, a model that allows you to predict what the watershed will look like at some point in the future. So basically, you look at how the watershed has changed, how land cover and land use have changed over your past period. And then you essentially do a statistical analysis and look at the drivers behind the change. And that could be a whole range of things. Literature usually provides a good guide as to what you would want to take into account. And of course, local experts should be consulted to identify the key drivers of change, right? And so once you have that understanding, you can construct a model, fit it to the past data, and then project it out. Usually that assumes, of course, that there are no major changes in the drivers of land change. But if you have expectations as to specific changes that might happen going forward, you can incorporate them, of course, into your modeling and into your projections. So basically that allows us to understand what's happening in the watershed, what it would look like without any intervention. Now comes the really interesting part. We need to understand how our interventions modify ecosystem functions and how those changes in ecosystem functions translate into the ecosystem services that we're interested in. In this case at hand, that's, like I said, the concentration of total suspended solids at the municipal water plant intake point downstream in the river. So how does watershed restoration, reforestation, riparian buffers, best management practices, rural roads management, how do they actually affect total sediment concentrations at the intake point, right? So that's, again, a whole range of modeling. And so here, as in any RNI analysis, we need to be very clear about what's the parameter of interest actually, right? So it's not sediment per se. It's rather only the fraction of it that is suspended, because that's the only fraction that makes it into the treatment plant, right? The rest is settled at the river bottom, and the plant doesn't really worry about it. It doesn't cause cost. So it's the suspended fraction. It's also important to consider whether this benefit accrues over the whole year or only during certain periods, right? So there might only be certain periods during which sediment is very high, and during which sediment reductions might be particularly valuable, while during other periods sediment isn't really a concern because it's very low. So we need to be very specific about understanding what's the exact service spatially, temporally, and what's the exact metric, if you will, of the service, right? So sediment isn't equal to sediment, depending on whether you're talking about a water treatment plant as the impacted unit, unit of interest, or about a hydropower plant, right? A hydropower plant usually worries about total sediment, not just suspended solids, right? So it's very important to take these considerations into account when you define your analysis, because that's what drives eventually the economic analysis later on, and it also drives the construction of your ecosystem modeling, essentially. In many cases, hydrologic modeling, as I'll be describing here in brevity. So once you understand that, like I said, you can construct your model, and then you need to figure out what parameters that model should be able to replicate, right? So in many cases, when you talk about water treatment plants, you might actually need daily concentrations, right? Or even hourly concentrations. And so you need to have a model that is actually able to do the analysis at those time steps, right? Many models might be able to generate annual data, others monthly, fewer daily, and even fewer hourly, right? And in some cases, that's really important. So that's something to take into account when you choose which model to represent. And certainly I'm talking about hydrologic modeling at this point. If you are concerned about other parameters, then obviously there are other models you can use for those, but the general principles apply to each of those. And so in this case, how do we apply this? We essentially used the soil and water assessment tool model and calibrated it to the local watershed. That involved installation of additional monitoring equipment that reported suspended, or actually that reported turbidity in 50-minute intervals. So it gave us a very high resolution picture of how the watershed behaves. And so that involved a fair amount of work. And collecting 2 years of data series. And so once you have a model, any model really, doesn't matter whether it's hydrologic or any other, you need to also be able to understand how well it performs. And so that's when model validation usually comes in, right? Calibration and validation, you can't just take a model and apply it without worrying about how it performs if you want to draw any reliable conclusions out of your modeling. And so that's again what we did here. We tried to calibrate the model on a historic data series, and then we looked how it performed on another section of historic data to see what the model error is, right? Fairly typical, and we did that for flow, which is very important for sediment, but then also for the actual turbidity, and took additional measures to relate turbidity to total suspended solids. So again, this is all standard practice, and that applies to any other model just as well. And so once we had that, we were able to run this calibrated and validated model on the business as usual land cover, essentially what we would expect the watershed to look like if there was no watershed conservation program, right? And that would give us, or that gave us the total suspended solids concentrations at the treatment intake point that would exist if there were no conservation happening in the watershed. We can contrast that with another model run that actually looks at the interventions and how they modify land cover in the watershed, and reruns the whole watershed with a new intervention land cover through the hydrologic model. So that gives us the alternate reality that we would be producing through our interventions in the watershed, right? And so basically that allows you to target conservation and restoration practices to the watershed to make sure that you get the biggest bang, if you will, for your intervention budget, right? Again, typical of any intervention, really, not limited to hydrologic intervention. And so having done these analyses allows us then to compare the total suspended solids concentrations in the base case scenario with the intervention scenario. And that really is the impact with respect to total suspended solids that this watershed conservation program in Camboriú is expected to have. There are other benefits, presumably for biodiversity, because it's a very endemics-rich watershed. So by increasing natural land cover, presumably there are other benefits. There might be ancillary benefits also in terms of reduced flood height, right? So the watershed, the lower part, especially the urban area, floods frequently. And so if you were able to reduce stream flow during high water periods, you would presumably reduce the extent of the flooding and therefore business interruption losses and structural damages as well as simply inconvenience to people. And so the next step is also crucial. Now we kind of understand how our program affects a key ecosystem service parameter of concern, namely total suspended solids concentrations at the drinking water intake point. We still need to add one more step to understand really what's the economic value of our intervention program. We need to understand what cost impacts, changes in costs those changes in total suspended solids concentrations have for the water treatment plant, right? And so that really involves detailed understanding of the operational processes of the water treatment plant. For that, it's really necessary to work closely with the treatment plant engineers. And again, this also applies to any other ecosystem service that you're interested in. You need to understand how the user actually is impacted by this. And for that, the best way is always to actually talk to them and get them involved in the analysis at an early stage. So that certainly will improve the quality of your results. And so you really need to also understand what is an actual benefit, right? So any reduction in sediment doesn't necessarily translate into a benefit. So we need to understand what the operational functions are, the operational processes, what the cost functions are of the water treatment plant. It might be that you reduce through your intervention sediment concentrations by an amount that really doesn't matter. It doesn't affect plant operational practices, and therefore there's no actual benefit. There's no cost savings that you could achieve by this. So it's really important to go beyond some simply modeled abstract extrapolations to really understanding the cost and operational practices of your presumptive user for whom you want to analyze the return on investment. And so in this case, that involved really understanding how the plant operates and all the points within the plant treatment processes that are affected by total suspended solids concentrations. And so there's a range of processes that we identified. That is, of course, chemicals application in the water treatment stage to actually take out sediments. It involves also then the quantity of sludge that's produced. If you have more sediment, you produce more sludge. You need to backflush your final filters more often, which leads to water losses. You need to then also landfill or otherwise dispose of your sludge. So those were the key processes that we identified here. And again, it is important to understand what the cost impacts of each of those are, and that's where the close collaboration of the users is critical for. So to give you just one example is if you reduce concentrations of total suspended solids, you, as I said, reduce water loss in treatment. Now, during high demand times, the plant would actually be able to sell this water. During low demand times, it would not be able to sell this water. So that's one example of how timing is very important. And of the factors that you need to take into account when you do return on investment analysis in order to be able to assure that your results are actually realistic. And so again, it's very helpful to have active input of the beneficiary that you're doing the ROI analysis for to understand whether or not the picture that you are painting is really realistic and to ensure that it is. Finally, return on investment. So let's get to investment. Which is basically the cost of the watershed conservation program. So here, really the key question is, for whom are you doing the return on investment analysis? Is it for the program overall? Do we want to understand what the economic rationale is for the watershed conservation program overall? Or do we want to understand what the economic case is, what the business case is for a specific user, right? So that really defines the boundaries of your cost analysis, right? So if you're just interested in a particular beneficiary, like a water treatment plant, then you only count the costs that they incur. But there might be additional costs that are borne by other program partners, right? Some technical expertise that's being provided by NGOs, by state agencies, right? And so if you do an analysis for the program as a whole, you would want to count those third-party costs, right? And you wouldn't want to do it if you just want to look at the business case for a particular beneficiary. And so, again, let me stress that it's very important, depending on what your boundaries for analysis are, to make sure that you capture all the costs that are important. So most economic analysis of watershed conservation do not include a large share of the transaction costs, which can actually be substantial. And those are the costs that are associated with building alliances to get the program up and running, keeping coordination flowing and ongoing between public stakeholders, private stakeholders, the actual program implementers, right? Keeping the landowners engaged, keeping the public informed and supportive of the program. And so those are costs that can be substantial and account for a substantial share of total program cost, right? Again, those would not be captured in a return on investment analysis for a particular entity like a water treatment plant, but for the program as a whole, you would need to make sure that you capture all of those costs. And so what does this mean in practice? So it really is important whose costs you account for and for whom you do the return on investment analysis. On this graph, the red line shows you the return on investment for the water treatment plant in the Camboriú watershed. And so that shows you obviously that the return on investment is very low initially because most of the costs are front-loaded. You need to actually do the restoration, do watershed conservation, install the monitoring, do the landowner outreach, build the program, if you will, and get it incorporated and running off the ground, all of which leads to high initial costs that then taper off over time, while on the other hand, the benefits that you create take time to establish themselves, right? Reforestation needs time to actually change land cover, several years to reduce sediment loading into streams in some cases. And so those benefits then increment over time. And so you have this mismatch between front-loaded costs and back-loaded benefits, which means that initially your return on investment will be fairly low, but as time goes by, it will increase. And at some point, hopefully, the returns will outweigh the initial investment, both expressed in present value terms, obviously. And so the red line indicates what we found in our case for the public utility. Basically, for reasonable timeframes of around 40 years, this program would have a positive return on investment, meaning it would make business sense for the company to invest in this program. And the company currently showed us much of the cost of the program, in fact, because they are convinced that over time they will benefit from it economically. That's a smart investment, if you will. The blue line shows you the perspective for the program overall. If you include all parties that have invested in this program, be it for consulting studies, be it multinational assistance in terms of installing monitoring equipment, stakeholder workshops, all of that, obviously the costs are larger. And I want to point out that in this picture, we're only looking at the sediment reduction benefits, right? So again, if we were to include other benefits, such as positive impacts on local biodiversity, reduced flooding potentially, right? The reduced risk of water supply shortfalls, which you could avoid by losing less water in the treatment process as a result of reduced sediment concentration. Those benefits also carry economic value. And so if you were to incorporate that, this blue line would shift upwards. At this point, that went beyond the scope of the analysis. But the main point in looking at this picture is simply to convey the fact that return on investment will increase over time if benefits and costs follow different trajectories over time. So selection of the timeline of your analysis is crucial in understanding what the return on investment in your program is. And so with that, I think we reached the end.